I'm Rick from Cartridge Classic Cars. On this video, we're going to do panel gapping. We're going to fine tune everything we had assembled on this Challenger, and we got another Cuda that we're going to go over too. I've done 3 E-body cars this last week, so I did a gapping video a while back, and I thought it got really good reviews and feedback on it, and I really kind of fine-tuned the process a little better and added a couple things. So I figured now might be a good time to try to redo the video, show you what I run into with these E-body cars and other cars. It might help you on how you fine-tune your car. I think this panel gapping is the make or break to make, like, you know, a regular car going down the road to that car that is just, someone looks at it as like, man, that car's a quality built car. Right now we're trying to shoot for better than factory gaps in general. I realize most of these cars were not gapped this well from the factory, but if we're building the cars, I think we're going to take more time to them. More people are looking at them and focus on now, so let's fine tune the gaps in the metalwork phase. What we're doing right now is everything before it goes to the body shop, because I'll tell you right now, if this car goes to the body shop the way it is, no offense saying body man, you know what's going to happen. They're going to cover that thing with filler front to rear, or they're going to cave and pave it. There's a dent, they're going to hit it down, and they're going to fill it right over. So in the metal aspect portion, who's ever doing the metal work, if you're doing it at home, I'm telling you, take the time right now, see what you got and get it as close as you possibly can. What that's going to allow you to do is have less filler on the car, less chances of paint delamination, less issues in general down the road. What we're going to shoot for on these cars, and again, all these cars are different. I do like my gaps a little bit tighter, but we're going to try to shoot for 3/16 gap, give or take. You see, we can run down there, no issue. What else we're going to also do, we're also going to focus on panel to panel for the most part. We're going to try to get these panels where they're in line, so when you look down the side and rub your hand, everything looks straight as best we can. Most of these panels have a slight curve to them, so the doors kind of want to roll in. We're going to try to fix that a little bit. Now, how we got to this point, just to save you some time and where we're at right now. This, of course, I don't know if you saw the videos, it's been a little bit since I touched this car. This is a 73 Challenger. We pretty much put every exterior part front to rear on this car except the front grille, because they don't make it, and the tail panel, because again, there's not an aftermarket tail panel. Besides that, this car is brand new front to rear, and most of the inner structure is brand new. If not, go back and watch the rest of the videos. You'll see how we got to this point. What I have done then, I've gotten these panels now that everything's done, fine-tuned and adjusted to get them as close as possible. This is kind of give or take. You might, I mean, I spend hours doing this, and what I'm doing, I'm going there with the gapping tool, front and rear, and we're trying to get these gaps as compromised. So the whole front end's on the car, so I'll look at the car and stare at it. For instance, this door. I know this door was a little bit far forward, so what we did, we loosened the hinges. You can get up in here in an E-body and in here. That's what's great about these cars, and I'll leave just the top hinge bolt loose and the bottom hinge bolt. We'll loosen the top and we'll kind of walk the door down. And then we'll tighten that, and then we walk the door, and then we loosen the bottom and walk it that way. So we're basically chasing the door back a little bit, and that's how you can adjust the door in between where the fender wants to go and in between the quarter. Again, we're talking very small, just fine-tuning everything. Then, once I end up doing that, you could take this long extension on these E-bodies, and it goes right up in there, and a wrench, and there's the bolts for the door this way. You know, and what you can end up doing, we could sit there and fine tune this door in and out to try to match the fender and the quarter panel. What I also like to do, I use this straight edge. As I'm doing it, we're gonna put the straight edge on this car. We look down and we're gonna go make sure they're in line at all the body lines best we can. Again, it's a compromise. So you see everything straight right there. And as I'm doing that, I'll come down here to this fender. There's 2 bolts in this fender, and that's going to adjust the fender in and out down here. What you want this door to run straight right along with this fender. And so if the fender curves in, you're going to pull shims out in this bottom bolt. If you got a big gap here on the door, you're going to pull this area down. be aware with these e-body cars, the fenders usually on the aftermarket fenders will roll in really bad at this lip right here. So if it's just doing that, I'll show you, we'll get the slide hammer, we're gonna pull that lip out and fix that. Main thing is you really wanna get this rocker lined up with the bottom of the fender and then match this gap right here. Now, saying that, I wouldn't say I messed up, but looking through and now we compromised on the car, I got the top lined up, and I also, another thing I did too, I put the hinges in the car. So I dipped the hinges in lacquer thinner and in the parts washer, we get all the grease and soot out of them. And what we want to be able to do, we want the hinges to be able to open and close really nice. Again, I also have new door hinges on the car, so there's no up and down movement. We don't want to be fighting that. We have our striker in, and I put the rubber pads inside here. This one actually had the factory pads in it, and the other side I put shim packs and rubber pads. And what we want to do, we want to be able to close the door, and we want no movement. So we want it solid and we want it lined up then. Same thing on the quarter, so we're going here. What I ended up doing and what I had to go back now that we're fine tuning the car, you see, now you can't really hold it like this a lot. You can sometimes, but on the Cudas, it curves up and out here. So sometimes you might have to hold the ruler like this and take a look at it. But for instance, this car, if we look at the door, we're coming straight, and you see right here, as I started adjusting it more and more, we're fitting down here with the door, the key measurements too. Sorry to jump around. You want to be straight off this rocker right here. You want the bottom to be straight as much as possible, and then you're really working off the corners. The four corners of the door with the Challengers, you gotta make sure the body lines are right. So we have all our body lines looking down the car straight, and we got the top one straight. What we're looking at, this bottom rocker down here looks perfect. It's coming off the rocker really nice. In the front, we gotta pull it out just a hair. It rolls in right there. But then, and right here, it looks really good. Same thing off our quarter, it's straight. With this quarter panel, if you see, you could kind of see the edge right here. Again, we're talking less than the ruler. So less than, 32nd of an inch we're talking about. But what we're gonna try to do, since we got it, we're gonna try to fix this quarter how it's going straight, and you see, I mean, it's amplified when we stick it out. But right there, you could see it's curving up and out. So what we're gonna wanna do, I'll show you how we're gonna fix that. That's our profiling issue. So right here is a big profiling issue, what we're gonna come back to when we work with the door. So we're gonna start on the back of the car. I like to start on the back of most of these cars and work our way forward since the front has more adjustment. Let's start gapping. What we're gonna use, we're gonna use these gapping tools. I got these off Amazon. If you want something cheaper, they're deck spacing gap tools. So you put your screws down. The reason I like these is I could stick 6 of them in a trunk area, and I can cut the panel, and you see I'll weld right next to them, and they're so cheap, we throw them away. And then this tool, if I need like a real fine-tuned gap or a more consistent, stronger tool, I'll use this one. But let's get to gap in the trunk, and I'll show you a couple steps. Some of it's gonna be in time lapse. We'll explain some other stuff. We'll kind of jump around a little bit, so stay tuned. Again, if you don't have an e-body, hang in there. I think this is gonna help no matter what kind of car you have. If you have a Mopar e-body, this will be very, I think, crucial, not very helpful to exactly what you're trying to do. All right, so the first thing we got is the trunk on these cars. What I like to do, the gap up here is at 3/16 right now. All the way forward, it looks pretty good. How we got that 3/16, I'll show you later on the Cuda, we're doing the same thing. We're gonna move the trunk forward a little bit. What that's gonna do, again, we want this gap to be straight off the deck filler panel. If you look right here, running down and checking these gaps, we got a good gap in the center, and it's too open up top, and it's too tight in the bottom. So we're gonna have to grind out the bottom here. We're gonna cut a little bit of that gap open. I'm gonna look we'll probably do it on the trunk here because we're gonna work the trunk. If it was just this, like you see, I did that Cuda last week or a couple days ago, so we'll end up cutting on the Cuda because the trunk on the Cuda looks good. To me, the trunk I think is the problem here, so we're gonna end up grinding on the trunk there, welding. Up here, we're gonna have to add filler. Not filler rod metal. You know, we're not using any body work in this phase. Another thing I was gonna say, I like to, once we get done with this gapping phase, that's done with all the metal work. I don't want to weld any more on this car. It's ready for body work. I also, another thing I just did it right after I started adjusting all the fenders, I've got to say, we welded in the rest of the subframe connectors. I don't do the subframe connectors until everything's adjusted properly. That way, just in case something crazy comes up, I can have an easier time fixing it. Once the subframe connectors go in this car, now it's solid front to rear. I've seen subframe connectors get welded in cars and then your gapping world is a nightmare. So now that it's in there, the car's not moving, subframe connector's in there. Technically, this car could come off the jig right now and be gapped. At this point, we're gonna just gap it on the jig. It's not being held front to rear. I think I got 2 tacks in the rocker holding it and the K-member's bolted in. That's about it. Besides that, car's sitting pretty much where it wants to go. So back to the gapping. So I'll show you how we're going to do this. Then right here, if you look, the Challengers and Cudas, they got this curvature in the back of the trunk. So what we're going to do is it's kind of coming in. We're going to have to end up cutting this here, and we're going to match this line. So we're going to have to bring this up since we kind of moved the trunk up just a little bit to close this gap. It's easier to fix this gap than up here. Same thing with back here. We're going to just end up coming right here, and we're going to basically put a slice in there, and we're going to fix that. Looking down this trunk gap looks really good, except it gets a little bit tight right there. So we're going to just do a little bit of grinding on that edge. Like I said, how I'm checking that, we're running the 3/16 right down it, and you see right there, about where I marked it, it starts getting tight. Right here, we have a little bit tight there, but it fits. Again, we're dialing this in where it's, you know, you're not gonna be able to see it. If this thing gets a little bit hung up, this is not gonna be like perfect. Someone's gonna go around here, measure each gap. Plus, you have some adjustment when you close. That's another thing too. Make sure you center your trunk with this gap at 3/16 and this gap at 3/16 centered. If they're not, adjust the trunk. Fix it here first and get them where they're all kind of even, so you're not trying to add in a 1/4 inch of filler rod over here and then you're cutting this side down. This is another reason I like to assemble everything and get everything perfect as we can now, because what you'll end up doing, you'll start welding on one area, then you'll adjust something else, and you'll come back and just redo what you just did. So right now, like I said, I can't stress that enough. The car's as perfect as we're gonna get it without cutting once on any of these panels. Now we're gonna fix it. So we got those, and then 2 other things. See what I did, this trunk was lower down here. We're working on the profile, and I did this when I was installing the trunk. It all looks good here, and what it did, the trunk started dipping down in this corner, and you could kind of see, I mean, it's not perfect, but when I was bending it up, putting a pry bar under here and kind of bending, I did put 3 dents in it, and we're gonna block those out later, and we'll pull those 3 dents out from us prying it up. So again, we gotta fix some of the stuff that, you know, it happens when you're pulling and prying. You have to fix your own stuff. So let's get to working on this trunk. We'll start the time lapse, and I'll kind of go over what I'm doing, and then we'll work our way right around this car. The first step in the process and what we're going to do, since the Challenger trunk is so straight, we're going to use some tape to really help us out. We run a straight line off the top. Now, why we couldn't cut the quarter panel on the top, because the deck filler to the quarter panel is set in our gap. So if we cut the quarter panel, it would actually bow in from the deck filler panel. That's why we have to fix this in the top right corner of the trunk. So what we did there, I ran a straight tape edge. We traced it out so we know our edge is straight at 3/16. I told you earlier, we're going to cut these back areas of the quarter panel to just match where the trim's going to go, meeting up with the trunk the edge of the trunk. What that's going to allow a smooth transition. We also cut with the cutoff wheel, that top driver's side corner on the trunk. Same thing, we're going to adjust it there, not the quarter panel. Everything looks straight. What I pulled out right now is 1/8 inch TIG rod. That's ER70S-2, I believe it was. It's the same stuff as a MIG rod, but in an 1/8 inch format. And what I'm going to do, I'm taking the MIG welder and I'm tack welding it, the part of the trunk that we want to add that gap to. We're obviously going to add more because what we're going to do, we're going to weld it, then we'll come back through and then grind it level. In the back, I'm basically just using a body hammer. I'm tapping up that 1/8 inch, not even 1/8 of an inch, whatever the distance of the cutoff wheel was. We tap that back in and kind of mold it. If we got to run over it again, we're going to do that. I think both of these in this Challenger were close enough. We only needed the one time. We're going to put a couple tacks just to hold everything in place with the MIG welder because it's easier to use the MIG with an extra hand free. I am going to TIG weld everything on this car. You see right here, external body wise. I'm just basically running with 16th inch tungsten, a number 5 cup. I'm using a red band and a blue all around band tungsten, gas lens, and I'm doing both sides of the outer edges, like the trunk, the door edges, everything right here. You can go back through and MIG weld all this. Just follow where you're spotting every so often, keeping everything cool and jumping around. The reason we're used a TIG welder, it's a softer weld. I feel like we can contain the heat a little bit better. And you see right here, we know there's no gaps or impurities in it because it was a solid run. So when you clean it up, it cleans up a little bit better. Another good thing about the TIG welder is we're able to hammer and dolly it around, which you see right here. We're going to need to on these edges of the doors, the trunk, everything else that we put a little bit of heat to her because it's going to want to shrink up, roll in the trunk and making it want to arch a little bit more. So we just hammer it back out. Saying that, on these flat trunks, I'm not going to pretend like we didn't get a high spot and warp it ever so slightly. So no big deal. We start it and we're going to take the stainless steel heat shrinking disc. We hold it over. We get the high spots really hot. And then what I'm doing, I'm taking a damp, cool rag and I'm holding it on that area, shrinking down the metal and then drying it off with the yellow rag. We keep repeating this process until we get this trunk completely flat. Throughout this whole video, the trunk area was the only issue I had with actually warping the metal. You see the rest of this car, I'm really welding right on the edge and I'm keeping my heat down and I'm kind of moving a little bit quicker. So everything else was stiff enough that I didn't have to worry about it. Here's some look at the finished weld on the corners. You can see we just worked the top. Once we grind them down, we put the trim in, we should be good to go. Looking at the trunk, there's our filler piece up in the top corner. I laid my tape edge again, got a straight edge to basically reference off of, and now I'm using 80 grit and 120 grit to really work those edges down to really cut all that extra material we put on and transition it really nice. Looking back, we have to adjust the plan a little bit because the bottom was still tight even after we took a little bit off the trunk. So just we're going to come back through on the quarter panel and we're going to cut it. We're going to use a body hammer, hammer it back in a little bit and just open up that gap a little bit with a punch to help us on the bottom to roll it under, and then you could see that gets us our gap. The main thing here is if you have a wide gap in the front and a tight gap in the back, you want your center at as close to 3/16 as you can, so you're splitting the difference. You only got to work the top a little bit and you only got to work the bottom a little bit. Same thing right here. You could see we went through, we tacked it up, and then here's a picture of the TIG weld before it's cleaned up. All right, so now that we're done with the trunk area, we'll work our way at the doors forward. We're going to do a passenger side first. I'm going to show you a couple things. We'll kind of go over what we're doing here, and then we'll just go in time lapse and start doing it. So the first thing we're going to do, all this red etch-in primer. The reason I use it, we could throw a little lacquer thinner on it and pretty much wipe it off. It was there basically just to protect the bare metal, knowing this car wasn't going to epoxy for a while. So let me open the door and we'll just get the etching primer off. I use a lacquer thinner so we don't have to excessively sand on the door. All right. So now we'll put that away. So the first thing we're gonna do right now, like I said, we're gonna profile the door, try to get as close as we can. Going back earlier, door latches in, door doesn't move, it closes. We have the body lines lined up as best we can, front to rear, bottom door gap, everything's as close as we can get it. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna check here, and I know what I'm looking for. I'm looking down this ruler, and we're looking, like I said, for the indent where the panels are bowing in. If they're bowing in, we're gonna grab the slide hammer, we're gonna pull them out. If they're bowing out, then we're gonna hit them back in. So looking at both the panels slightly right here all the way down, they're arched in. So the door's good here. We're gonna take the slide hammer in here. Now with the slide hammer, you're not gonna hit on it really hard. You're just letting the weight of the hammer do the job. So and then we'll do the door side and recheck it. All right, let's check it again. So this has actually got to go down a little there now. So when we're hitting it, we're taking the hammer, we're kind of rolling it in, and we're not bouncing off it, we're keeping pressure on it. All right, you can tell the door needs to come out a little bit more. And you could see the edge of the door moving. What we're trying to do, we're trying to make sure, we're gonna try to do as best we can get them close. We don't wanna pack the edges full of filler if they're curving down. All right. So you get the idea that we're gonna, actually that's looking pretty good. What we're gonna do now, just this area. Now we're gonna hit both sides down together. All right, so saving on time, I'm gonna work this more, but you get the idea what we're doing. We're kind of just trying to get everything straight down this whole side, and we'll use a straight edge. Now, looking at gaps here, we already know we're taking, like I said, we're gonna kind of do a tight 3/16 give or take. It doesn't have to be perfect, but we know up top here, we're gonna have to grind that out. And I'll show a lot of this on time lapse. So right there gets tight. Looking down, we're tight right around this edge right here. We'll kind of grind in there a little bit. Actually, what we're gonna do there, the door, we're gonna take the door side there. Trying to just take whatever way looks natural. So coming down this door, we look good. I mean, like I said, we're a little bit tight, but I can live with that. And I did, if you go back a couple videos, when we put the front end on this car, I adjusted so we would have a little bit tighter gaps on it. So I like tighter gaps personally. So going down, everything looks good there. And then right here, the door's hitting the fender. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna mark off the door area, and we're gonna end up cutting the door there. So that's about what we're gonna do to match that gap. And you could see, I mean, our lines lined up. This is just a bad stamp in between the door and the fender. That's what you're gonna get. And then coming back down the rest of the way on the 3/16, we can probably just grind on this edge a little bit here. We should be able to get away where we don't gotta cut it. Just a little bit of trimming we'll do, and then the rest of the way, a little bit more right there on the bow and on that very corner. All right, so that's that. So back here, what we're looking at, like we said, this area is actually so far out, we're not going to be able to fix it with the slide hammer, and we don't want to pack a bunch of Bondo in there. So let's get the goggles on. We're going to grind this down, and we'll fix this real quick, get it tacked up, and then we'll come back and I'll show you how we TIG weld it just like everything else and fix this thing. So let's go ahead and clean it up and start cutting it.
It's going to be easier to clean every panel before you start the cutting process.
All right, so we're good down here and we're good about right there. So we're basically gonna slice on the inside of this door, and then we're gonna grind the edge down and then tack it back up.
You want to cut as close to the door jamb edge without going too deep and hurting the bracket as you can.
And you see, well, we push that in, that's what we're looking for. Now, we also want to check the gap while we're here, because I think this gap is actually a little too tight too, just a hair. So it gets a little bit tight right there. So we'll push it in a little bit, but that's about what we have on the front. So, like I said, see, the quarter panel is already naturally about lined up there. Right here, we're gonna have to hit it in a little bit. And if it gets really bad, what we'll do, we're gonna relief cut it right here. We might have to end up doing that. So we're gonna go all the way down there and possibly relief cut it. We're gonna work from the top down, getting it level though. And I'm not gonna cut up to the body, I'll cut right up to the body line, but I wanna disturb the body line yet.
You could see why we want to cut so close to the edge, because now we just got to grind the door jamb lip down carefully without touching the exterior quarter, and that's going to level everything up where the quarter's already naturally sitting.
All right, so now I'm gonna get the welder turned on. Right here, we're lined up, and we're gonna start working our way down with the welder. Actually, I'm gonna clean that one area up right there.
You could really see what a huge difference a couple minutes takes in just changing the profile.
We got the welder on, and now the idea is we're gonna put our 3/16 gapping tool in there to at least get our 3/16, and we're basically gonna take this, which we're level there now, and see, now I can look right across the door and know we're good. So there's that. Move it down.
If you're just MIG welding and not using a TIG welder, still do this step and go through it and just tack everything up carefully, then come back through it and fully MIG tack it up.
See right here, the gap kind of goes in a little bit, so I don't want to fight it. We're just gonna pry it over just a hair. Try and just make that natural looking gap, and that really helped it out right there.
The idea behind tacking it is if you mess up your gap, check it, come back through and cut a tack or two and fix it.
What I'm gonna do, we're gonna, like I said, relief cut it right here, and that should let this thing ease in, because see, it's trying to bunch up because we're now pushing this quarter panel down.
Get all your tacks done in one area before you final weld.
So now what I wanna do too, we gotta grind this down a little bit more before we start welding on it.
The whole concept is we want to find out, obviously the metal is high and we have excess metal in the area. So we're chasing the high area down, and we're basically coming through and relief cutting it without changing the body line.
I think that would get about what we're looking for. Yeah. That's got it right there. So we're gonna kind of push it in a little bit, and you can see now with this relief cut, we'll pull that back out. So let's tack this. Actually, what I want to do, I want to make sure the edge isn't rolled under. See how the edge is trying to roll under? We don't want that. So we want to kind of pull it out. Let me get a hammer. Kind of straighten it out. All right. See, so now when we pull it down, it kind of comes in straighter. We got to get our gap set. You can see our gap. Actually, our gap looks pretty good right there. The only thing we're binding on is just that tack, so we're good there.
What I didn't show in the future was I actually had to take that 2-inch cut in the quarter panel and extend it almost all the way to the rear wheel to just really blend that edge down and make the transition a little bit easier. Again, chasing that highs, it takes some time.
So you see, compared to what we started with, looking down this car now, this whole door's level. Looking at it, we could sit there and take our straight edge, and you can see it's got a little bit of a curve from here to here, but I mean, that's the body line of these Challengers. We're okay with that. What we didn't want to look down the door and see it sticking out. Now it's a good, easy transition. I'm gonna cut off right now. We're still gonna do the same thing up here. I'm gonna cut it, grind it down, and we're gonna work this. This area looks good. We'll just hammer and dolly that out a little bit, and then up here we'll work this gap. So we're gonna go in time lapse now that we did this. We're gonna go to the other side. On the other side, the gap up here is really open. I'll show you different scenarios on this car, and then we'll jump over to the Cuda a little bit later in the video. So stay tuned and let's start working on this.
I will say about this TIG process, if you do TIG welding on the gaps and you're not on a rotisserie, which I don't think you should be gapping a car on a rotisserie, it should be on its wheels or on a flat surface. But in the TIG process, it's going to be very uncomfortable to sit there and get to a lot of these areas. You could see I have to take breaks because my arms get tired, because everything right now is time-lapsed about 8 times faster than the real-time speed. I have used the foot pedal, duct tape to my foot, and laying on the ground, pushing off something, using my knee. It's just you're bending different angles. Your arms are going to get tired. You're obviously going to dip the tungsten in these weird angles, and all your TIG welds aren't going to be as perfect if you were going to sit there and just be standing straight on a comfortable table. Moving ahead to the fender, I did the same thing as we did to the trunk. We got the fender as close as we could to 3/16 on most of the fender. Saying that, I always like to try to remove metal versus adding metal to a piece. You could see it definitely makes it easier. So what we did, we removed most of the metal, and I'm coming back through since the metal door split from us removing so much, and I TIG welded it back up. Once I do that, I take my 80 grit and I'll sit there and I clean up the edge and just work it down and just fine tune it with the gapping tool. Onto the driver's side door, I would say this door by far is the worst gap on this whole Challenger. You can see it's almost hitting the bottom and it's really wide in the top. So we get the center as close as we can, and we're going to work both the top and bottom. This is also a Dynacorn door and an AMD fender, so that might have something to do with the curvature and everything else. What I'm going to do here, you see I relief cut just like we would pushing the panels together, and now I'm taking a pry bar screwdriver and I'm opening up the gap that 1/8 inch. We're taking our filler rod, our TIG filler rod we used earlier, and again we're jamming it in there, kind of opening it up and getting a smooth transition. I'm going to come back through, you'll see in a little bit, and I'm going to TIG that filler rod. The good thing about TIG welding that filler rod is I'm using that as material all the way down on the ground. I'm kind of smoothing it out back and forth. So with the MIG welder, you'd be adding more and more material, where the TIG welder, you're kind of just smoothing everything out, and the cleanup phase gets a little bit easier. So we're still just blending this transition. I'm making a bunch of notes on it, and you could see we're cutting little pieces of the TIG rod to just make it more controllable and easier to work with. I think this upper door to quarter gap is the most important part of this whole video. What it's going to show you is don't get so hung up on the gaps. Yes, they're important to get them close, but if you get something that you're really stuck on, you can come back through with a new sheet metal and fix it, where anyone looking at this car, even in the metal state down the road when we're all said and done, is not going to even know it's worked. This gap was so bad though, you could see I'm working the quarter panel, and now we're going to add a little bit of filler rod on the door, just because if, again, like a trunk, if we work both edges a little bit, now we're not making any big crazy obvious modifications to the body. I said it earlier, but right now I want to show you. This is the TIG welding in real-time speed. Also, look at the machine behind me. I'm showing you the amps and the difference on the amps of the foot pedal input. You could see how much I'm jumping around. We're down to 25 amps moving up and down depending on the filler rod application and the speed we're going and what we're needed there. Now we're back in time lapse on the door, and you can see I'm not adding as much filler rod, mostly just blending the filler rod in. We're going to do that on both sides, and again, same thing with the trunk. We had to hammer dolly this door right around. Once we get our good clean edge, you could see the profile didn't change on here, but I could take the 80 grit on the sander and come back through it and just clean up that edge. And like I said earlier, now that you see it, this door is just profiled really nice, and it looks natural now. Everything looks good. We're just kind of taking the slide hammer and fine tuning everything, mostly from where the heat warped it in and out. I did work the bottom too on this door, and now everything is a clean, even gap. The top of this thing, same thing. The quarter panel was just sitting a little bit high. I mean, you had to stare at it long enough to really notice, but while we're fixing stuff, we might as well go through and fix that quarter panel to door transition. It was the same process. We just cut a slit in it, hammer it down, and tack it and TIG weld it. The driver's side fender was a little bit easier. I was able to TIG weld it on the car and clean it up without removing the fender.
Now, moving on from the Challenger, I'm going to show you on the 70 Cuda, the same thing. When we put aftermarket parts on these cars, a lot of things I run into on this side of the e-bodies, what we do to adjust them. And it seems like I said on earlier, most of the aftermarket parts seem to have the same discrepancies no matter what car we put them on. So on these Cudas, what we're looking at is the trunk gap here. It seems like most of the time when you put these aftermarket quarter panels, at least from AMD, and we put the trunk on, it really wants to, even with their deck filler panel, and the window fits in this channel really well, it seems like the trunk gap wants to open up a little bit wide. Now, some of the factory cars look that way, but I like to tighten it up. So you saw on an earlier video when we did the Cuda, I ended up welding some of this trunk, and it's a lot of work. So a little trick that I like to do on this car is I also like to sit there and move the trunk forward this way. And what it does, you could see it's going to stick out past the quarter panels on both sides just a little bit. And then what I do, we're on a loose 3/16, but to me this gap looks clean and it's a good compromise on everything. It doesn't stand out. And then what we're going to end up doing, I'll show you in a minute, we're going to basically just cut this quarter panel here, and we're going to cut it right here, right down the side, and we're going to blend this angle in where the trim is. So we're basically going to match the angle of the trunk with this quarter panel. If it's really bad, we can slice on the bottom, and same thing, put our weld on the bottom too to kind of just roll this edge in a little bit. So that puts us on these sides too, looking at it, we're a loose 1/8 inch, and you could see this side right here, you could see on the quarter panel how it's kind of curving in, and what we're going to end up doing, we're going to cut right at this bottom edge of the quarter, because I know the trunk is what's spaced out right. Now, saying that, I also, like the Challenger, have the spacers on the edge of the trunk. So we're also set in height here where our latch isn't moving up and down a whole bunch. But this side of the car looks really good for the most part. We might fine tune this a little bit. We'll get into it. The last thing we're going to do on this trunk, when I got the car, this is a factory trunk and it had a bunch of polyester primer. So looking at it, I stripped it down. The trunk looked like it's really good. This is something that I dial into right now, is basically when I set some epoxy on it, you can really start seeing the waves and the hills in it where it looks like it got hit by like some hail damage or something hit this car. And like I said, you can't see it, but if I sit there and look down the side of it, I know where the dents are and I can feel it. But what we're going to do, I'll show you, we'll block it out. Again, this is going to show us where our highs and our lows are. So on this trunk, you can see it's not as nice, and some of this will have to be like right here, this is so small, this is going to be body work, but right here there's a major dent, and I'm going to circle them right now so I could show you what we're going to work. See, there's a high spot here, and right here this is a low spot that we can feel. So we're going to try to pull that out just to help the body man out and save on the filler. There's a low spot there. Looking down at, there's one right there I think we could pull out. And you can see it's actually creating a whole low. And the epoxy clogs the sandpaper quite a bit when we work it aggressive, so it's not ideal. But you can see right here is the center of that dent where it's rolling down. This might be a complete low, and I think that's it on this trunk. There's one more little one over here too. So right there, there's a dent there. So we're gonna work those lows out of this car too. So stay tuned, we'll come back. I'm gonna work on the back end of this Cuda, and we're gonna work our way forward kind of in time lapse on the rest of this Cuda on gapping it, and I'll voice over some of the things I run across on this car.
I know on the Cuda and this trunk, some of it's going to be a little bit repetitive as I'm showing it again, but the reason I want to show you is it doesn't really matter the car. If you have a Camaro, if you have a Mustang and the trunk doesn't fit or the gap is loose up top, you could sit there and follow these same steps. You know, obviously with the Mustang, you would cut it before the cap and move the whole cap up, kind of like the Cudas and the Challengers with the trim rings. But you see, we cut the quarters. We're always trying to work on the quarters, knowing they're not going to bend and warp as easy as a trunk would. I'm taking my gapping tools, and you see I just left them in there to hold my gap, and I just MIG weld tacked between all of them, adjusting it and blending it back into the quarter panel with a screwdriver. What you don't want a hard transition. That's the key here, to let everything flow easy back in there. Cutting the end cap, same thing. You can see everything's tacked up right here. The gap, everything looks good. If it's not, we'll go back through, we'll cut a tack or two and reblend it before we go ahead and start the TIG welding process on that. I also want to reiterate, all this stuff can be done with a MIG welder. You don't have to take the TIG welder out one time. I personally think it does come out a little bit better, and the quality is a little better with the TIG welder. So if you want that extra credit, practice your TIG welder, and really, this is not that hard if you get on areas like this trunk that's very comfortable and you could run a straight run down. What I'm using 16th inch tungsten. I'm running a red band tungsten with 16-inch filler rod, a number 5 cup, a gas lens, and I'm running my gas flow at 10 CF8. I have my amperage set to about 55 amps, but you saw earlier in the video how I'm really dialing it back at times to 20 amps if the thing starts trying to blow out a little bit. On this Cuda, I said earlier in the video that what I'm using right here, instead of really the straight edge on the hard curvature, I'm using the paint stick to really get a good radius on checking everything else. I will say the quarter panels on these Cudas, they really seem to fit really well. The front fenders on the Cudas, they always seem to get tight in the middle, and the top and bottom gap usually come out really good. So we're always going to have to work the front fenders, it seems like, on these Cudas. The first step is to pull everything out to really get a good solid adjustment. You want to pull everything out first and get everything profiled, because once you start welding, that profile might change your gap angle and everything else. So you're going to profile the door first, we're going to trace it and gap it, and then we're going to have to come back through after we're done welding and reprofile the car, because it's going to want to shrink back in again. So cleaning up this area, like I said, we're going to take the center out basically. We are going to do this Cuda fender a little bit different than the Challenger fender. What I mean by that is I'm taking the cutoff wheel and I'm not cutting the edge. I'm cutting just on the inside of the edge. Then I'm going to take a body hammer, a couple punches and everything else, and we're basically rolling the lip around on the fender, where that's going to close the gap without having us to actually build the edge back up. You could see right here, once I tack it, that's the factory kind of body edge rolled around. To me, on these fenders, it gives a cleaner look when you do it that way. I've done done this on a lot of F-body fenders. Anything that's more flush and flat, you usually can get away with this on the fenders. And then once we TIG weld it, it really does look good in the long run. You could fine tune it with a pry bar and just get everything where your gap's perfect. As I said, on this side, we're going to show the process from a slightly different angle, but it's literally the same thing on the passenger side fender. We're working the gap out now. It gets tight in the center, and the top and bottom are radiused and profiled really well. The main thing is getting the lower rocker centered off the fender. It's the same thing here. I'm running my mark down it, and with the gapping tool, and same thing. We'll go back through, we'll cut it, tap it over. I like to tap it over and kind of bend it on the car, because that really, of course, gets our true 100% gap. And then what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back through and I'm going to take both the fenders off on this car. That's what's awesome about these e-body cars, is we can pull the fenders off on them without taking the hood off and a lot of other parts. And I can really get in a real comfortable position and pull a better TIG weld. Once you're running a little bit faster and you're in a comfortable TIG welding position, you're obviously running less heat. So that's a big misconception in the welding world. Really, the heat input is amperage times time. So if you even run a higher amperage, but you're rolling through your weld a lot faster, you're actually putting less in heat input than if you're going to cut that amperage in half and sit in there 3 times as long to take the weld. You could see the heat affected zone on this fender doesn't extend into the fender that much. We're on the support bracket. So really, the only edges we're really affected is this area that we're hammer and dollying and flanishing back out. I'm taking the straight edge, and we're just making sure everything's straight and lined up. It's easier to do it now that we're off the car instead of messing with the slide hammer. This front area, that was another thing on these fenders that just wasn't fitting right on the 70 on both sides. They weren't even close. So what we're basically doing, we're cutting it, and I'm going to sit there and hammer the edge around and kind of roll the fenders at the right angle. So we took material out of the top and we're adding it in the bottom. Now with this, I gotta say, I'm just gonna MIG weld this area. This is gonna be behind the bumper. No one's gonna see it. So really, we're just kind of making everything flow better, stronger, and just fix it nicer, where we know the TIG welder wasn't really worth coming in here and then spending all that time, where right now the MIG welder is going to save a bunch of energy. So this is a perfect example that you can use a MIG welder and do exactly what you're trying to do with the TIG welder. And when it's all said and done, we'll show you pictures of this car. You're going to see you can't tell the difference whether it's TIG welded or MIG welded. Now with the MIG welder, do not do this if you're on the middle of a fender or a quarter panel or something. You will warp it. Right here, you see the curvature here is really holding the front fender shape. So I could sit there and just pack the bead right down and not worry about warping anything. I do every now and then, if I am worried about heat, I'll touch the fender, make sure. But like I said, with this area, I knew nothing was going to warp, and I wasn't worried about that. In my experience, I think the Cudas need a little bit less work on the gapping than the Challengers do. Now we're moving on to those dents. I got my pro spot with my dent puller. Basically, I'm hitting the trigger. It welds the slide hammer stud onto the bare metal, and I'm able to just tap up. I'm not going crazy and creating a high spot. And then what you do to get it off, you just do a slight twist. Once you do that, you can dent pull this thing over and over again. You could put 20, 30 dent pulls in one area and you're not wasting studs. It really is a good tool, and we're going to go over a lot more in the next video. So I think the final step in any gapping project is really to get the car down to bare metal, so we know before we put our bodywork and it goes to bodywork that it has a solid base sealed up with epoxy primer. Saying that, I don't trust the E-coat. I said it many times on other videos. On the outside, anywhere we're going to do major bodywork. So we're going to strip these fenders down to bare metal using the Eastwood 40 grit stripping drum. You see, it does really remove this stuff really easy. It doesn't warp it. This is the way to strip these E-coat panels. And then Now that it's bare metal, it is too smooth to currently put epoxy on it. So I will have to come back through and run an 80 grit, 120 grit on the DA sander to really just scuff everything up.
All right, so kind of finishing up on the metal work on the 70 Cuda. I got one more spot as I'm going around right now cleaning everything up and DA sanding the car that I got to fix the deck filler panel. But you can see back here on the tail panel, both these trunk gaps, I think they came out pretty good on the before and after. You saw how we fixed those. What I also do when I'm doing after, so right now this whole car has been DA sanded, because I like when I deliver the car to an owner, you know, when we're at this level, that I like it all just fresh, clean. This car had a bunch of scratches on it, had imperfections where we're working and metal grinding things out. So I just DA'd the whole car in 220 according to the TDS, and we're going to shoot one coat of epoxy on the whole car front to rear. I do have to still pull off the front fenders and strip the inside of them too and epoxy them, so the fenders will be done off the car and then we'll reinstall it. What I also like to do as I'm using my wax and grease remover, you know, make sure there's no fingerprints on the car and everything else, I'll run my wax and grease remover at a steady stream, right? And what we'll do, we'll kind of wipe down the car real smooth. And then what we'll do is, this is almost going to simulate almost a clear coat. So what we'll do after I wipe it down, it'll be wet for a little bit. You know, we can look down this car and we can see any kind of waves or anything that's going to stand out. So I'll do that on all sides of the car, and you'll be surprised what dents and everything you're going to come find out. That's how another reason I've checked the trunk dents and they're good to go. So like I said, DA the quarter panels, we fixed that area right here. Looking at the door gap, it's all metal finished out. I'm not going to touch it because, again, from this point on with the wax and grease remover, we're trying to use just gloves on everything else. But the gap looks really good. This car should go together for its final assembly really well. We also did the front bumper areas. You saw what they looked like before and after. They came out really good also. Now, the one thing on this car, you could see this hood. The hood is rusted, it's unfixable. It's fixable, but compared to the rest of this project, the owner and I are talking that the hood is not going to be salvaged. He's currently looking for a hood. There's a good chance I'm not going to put the hood on the car. Hopefully he could just bolt it on, and as long as it's the same size as this hood, there should be no issues. Now, saying that, if there are any issues, I'll take the car back and I'll fix it. But normally you would gap the car with the proper hood and everything else, but I have pretty big confidence that we should be all right there. So what we're going to do on this car, like I said, we're wrapping up. We're going to jump back on the 73 Challenger and finish the video out with there. This car I'm going to throw on a YouTube short and put it together as a quick walk around video, just because I haven't filmed anything else on this car, but you get the idea if you're doing a Cuda version of the e-bodies, what to run across with and what issues you have. So like I said, we're going to fresh coat this thing in epoxy. Once we take the fenders off and, you know, finish a couple of the gapping area back there, but we'll do the fresh coat of epoxy, and then this car, put the suspension on, it's ready to come off the jig. It also, of course, had the subframe connectors in it, so before we gapped it just like the Challenger, but once it's ready for the epoxy, it'll be ready for the body shop. I'm not doing the body work on this car, but like I said, when it gets delivered, it'll just look really good. So let's wrap up this part of the project. Let's jump back over to Challenger and finish that car out, and I'll show you the next step in a car that we're going to do body work and how it's going to be a little different than one that's sent off going to a different body shop.
So another thing we didn't do on the Cuda that we're going to do on the Challenger, and honestly is part of the gapping phase, is really installing the bumpers and customizing them if you want them pulled in or adjusted, or just checking the final fitment. You want to make sure the bumpers fit, and then, you know, or have the side-to-side movement, and there's nothing crazy that fits on front to rear. Usually with brand new aftermarket fenders, I haven't had any major issues with it. The back sometimes, if you got to just double check, make sure they're level, but you see right here, we bolted them on. Everything fit really good on this 72.
All right, we're gonna wrap up the video on the 73 Challenger and the Cuda. I really hope this video helped you out on gapping, and no matter what kind of car you have, Camaro, Mustang, Firebird, I mean, you name it, Nova, the concept's the same. Just take that, adapt it to your car. If you have an e-body and you're doing the aftermarket panels, you know what certain things to look for and what to expect when buying these panels. I wanted to do more on this car in this video. The idea was, you know, we're going to strip the car down. I was going to show you what to do on the LED channel when you're not using LED, some you know, alternatives, and that's what we're going to end up doing on this car. And I was going to start the bodywork phase and kind of show you how we go about doing that, along with pulling the dents out back here that I showed earlier in the video, but we're just running out of time. So I'm going to come back. Next video, we're gonna do all that. I'm gonna go into that a little bit deeper and laying the foundation before the body work on more of a driver quality and how we're gonna go about doing that. I did promise that in the past, so here we are, we're gonna do that. That video will be coming out very shortly, so stay tuned, because we're getting another car here tomorrow and it needs to go on this frame jig. And not to give away what the kind of car is, but we don't have to modify the frame jig at all. So maybe I'll be able to get it on the channel a little bit. We'll see how that goes. Let's go over this Challenger right now. Looking over the trunk, you can see the gapping in the back came out really well. You know, we straightened the edges out. The trunk wasn't that bad. Looking at the door on that side, you remember we fixed the profile area on the very bottom of the car. We cut that down. I also had the slice on down here on the other side. We cut that indent in and we did move it all the way back. But now if I take a straight edge, it's got the very nice curvature of the Challenger. Everything flows really nice. Same thing with that front gap. We did fix that, straighten that out. Along with this gap, what I told you earlier, don't forget, think about, look at the car, make it look natural. Find out what panel is off a little bit more than the other and work that panel. For instance, this area up here was the worst part of the whole car. We decided, or I decided, that I was gonna work both sides so we don't change one side too much. Now looking at the car, it looks natural to a Challenger. The curve flows really good. I just believe the door was slightly off and I believe the quarter was slightly off. This was also a Dynacorn door on an AMD quarter because of a parts availability. On these front gaps, you saw some different tricks I did on that side where we took the whole fender off and welded up along with the Cuda. On this Challenger, I was able to open the door, roll that back and fix the gap there. The hood looked really good. We had a spot down there in the corner to fix and that spot up by the fender. You see the last thing that Megan and I did, we put the bumpers on the car. The idea behind that is you just want to make sure they should be the easiest to modify if you have to move them up and down. What you can do is in the bumper brackets, they got the holes in the bumper brackets, take a deburring tool and just open it up if you had to. This car, honestly, the bumpers went on with no issue. So really happy with that. In general, this car, I think it looks better than a factory Challenger. I was actually talking to a buddy the other day who I grew up, and he restores Mopars also. I grew up with him, and he gave me, we were kind of talking about, you know, what's wrong with the Mopar community and just car restoration in general. And he kind of, what I thought, he gave me a compliment, and he didn't mean it as a compliment. He says that I over-restore cars, and I took that as a giant compliment because I think that's what we're trying to do here. If he sees this video, he's gonna, that's the first thing he's gonna think is this car's overly restored. And I think it's really cool from a builder aspect. Same thing if you have one of these cars. It's really cool to go to a car show, and if someone says, yep, that's definitely not factory because it's nicer than factory. That's what I'm striving for. If you like that, here's how to do it. I think it's something to be proud of if you're a builder. I think, you know, this is the difference on a car, on someone that really wants to spend the time and really work everything versus just bolting a fender on, and if it fits, it fits. If it doesn't, that's how factory did it. Same thing with the rest of the cars. You could throw them on and the gaps be all over the place. And if that's what you want, that's fine. But, you know, like I said, I think these are the cars that really stand out, and really, it takes a lot of time, but in the paint and body phase now, like I said, everything's gonna be evened out. We're gonna save a lot of time there. And then down the road, we don't have to worry about edges chipping. Everything's spot on, everything's gap good. It's gonna just save us headaches down the road. And personally, I think it looks a little nicer. I hope this video helped you out. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you all who have subscribed to the channel. If you haven't, please subscribe. Like the videos if it's helping you out. I really do appreciate it. The channel's been growing a lot, and it really does help us out. So again, I'll see you on the next video. I'm Rick from Carthage Classic Cars, and have a good day.